How is everyone? Are you all active gardeners? Yeah,
Try to be.
try to be. All right, well, it's a really challenging area for gardening. And one of the reasons is the soil here is not very good. We have different kinds of soil in different parts of town, but it's all pretty bad. Um, and one of the main reasons for that is it's really dry, low humidity, the soil dries out, nutrients blow away, hard to keep microorganisms alive in your soil, keep organic matter in your soil. So, compared to like Georgia or Pennsylvania or a place in the Midwest, they've been leaves and organic matter have been falling on the ground, and it's humid enough that they basically almost compost right on the ground. So over years and years, it's built up this really rich soil. That's why they say in Pennsylvania, when a garden, you just throw a handful of seeds out the window and everything grows. And here you have to really work to get your soil ready. People say, I want to garden. It's like, well, first thing to do is to get your soil, amend your soil. It might take you a year to get your soil, really ready to be able to grow in the ground. So let's see. So stop treating your soil like dirt. This is a call to action from soil ecologists. And soil is and we would maybe normally think of it as topsoil. It's a complex mix of minerals, organic matter, water, air, living organisms. And it serves as the growth medium for land plants. Soil is constantly evolving and breaking down. And soil is the largest reservoir of carbon on Earth, larger than all the forests on Earth. And it's kind of hard to imagine, but you've probably read about the tundra and how much, organic matter has been stored in the tundra in, the Northern Hemisphere. And dirt is what you get on your clothes when you work in the soil. Dirt's what you make roads out of. Soil is a almost living organism, or needs to be treated like a living organism. And we're losing our topsoil from mechanical plowing. Pesticides kill the microorganisms, drought and erosion, and flooding. When they talk about floods in the farming lands, we all think, well, it's terrible, they lost the season. Well, they also probably lost a lot of topsoil. When they had floods in Texas, a lot of topsoil washed into the Gulf of Mexico. And it takes a long time to build topsoil. Treat your soil like a living organism. Feed it organic matter. That's the constant refrain from soil ecologists. More organic matter in your soil. Keep it covered and moist even in the winter. That's one of the things that I was a little slow to learn, that you can keep your soil really nice through the season, but then if you don't cover it in the winter, the topsoil dries out and nutrients blow away and the microorganisms die and the worms will even go away. I use mulch. I use pine needles. They're really plentiful. I don't have to travel very far. I have 16 ponderosa pines, rake them up, throw them on the beds in the fall. And I put compost down first, and then I throw pine needles on top. And I do rake the whole pine needles off, but I do compost pine needles too. Cover crops are crops that we plant specifically to improve the soil. There are lots of different uses for cover crops, but here they will hold moisture in the soil. If you mulch your cover crops, you don't really have to water them a lot of times all winter. I use Austrian winter peas and winter wheat. Winter wheat will grow in the fall, and then it'll stop growing in the coldest part of the winter, and then it starts growing again in the spring. And then you chop it in, lots of different ways to work cover crops into the soil. I took a soil seminar down in Rimrock from a farmer down there, and they are very concerned about not tilling their soil. So they grow cover crops, and then they weed whack the greens, and they cover them with cardboard or tarps, and then they have a dance party, and they dance on it to break them up. But they don't ever, and for me, I usually will dig the first 6 or 8 inches of the soil to dig my cover crops in. But maybe someday I will get to where I don't have to. A single teaspoon of healthy soil contains more microorganisms than all the people on Earth. A little hard to visualize, but that's what you're trying to keep alive. And then what does soil consist of? Well, we think of soil as being mostly mineral, but it's actually about 50% mineral. This is healthy soil we're talking about. It has mineral particles. And where do the minerals come from? Whatever rocks are in the area. So my yard is full of limestone. So my soil is broken down limestone. If you have basalt in your yard, then you probably got broken down, basalt, which is good because basalt has a lot of micronutrients. Limestone is very alkaline, and yeah, and it has some minerals, but they don't seem to release into the plants very well. And then about 5%, if your soil is really healthy, of organic matter. And then half of the soil should be open areas. And that's a little hard to envision, but those open areas become space for water, air, and roots can easily go through. If you don't, we are going to send you these slides, by the way. I don't know if, but we were going to hand them out ahead of time, but it just seems better. We'll send you the whole slides instead of a condensed version. And that's where roots go through. And while we're thinking about soil, this is some garden soil from my yard. And we'll wait for these other samples. So, and then part of it is there's also microorganisms living throughout. Those are earthworms, fungi, bacteria, nematodes. Earthworms are especially helpful. They say you would like to have 40 earthworms per cubic foot. And that's a lot. I will talk, we're going to talk about worm composting at the end. And I have some worms out that I've put out in my garden. And now I'm getting close to that, but it's taken a long time. So soil aggregates. So soil structure, when I first had my master gardener class and they said, soil structure. And I'm like, well, my soil just kind of gets compacted into one big lump. What kind of structure is that? Well, there are actually descriptors for that. But what you want is for the organic matter and the earthworms and the microorganisms to break it up into these things called aggregates or PEDs. And these are small clumps. And you can kind of see it in my soil. Wasn't that way always. And these aggregates are like semi-waterproof, water resistant, but if they're wet and you work the soil, you'll smash them up. And then you get more like into individual grains, which are not going to be as good at creating open spaces. And if you just overtill the soil, that's why, we say no-till gardening or farming, but it's pretty challenging until you get your soil really, when you have really good soil, then you can work on that. But to get there, you're probably going to have to work at some, but you just want to be careful about it. And want to work it as little as possible. And this is just to give you a visual for how those aggregates create open spaces. This is literally just a pile of rocks, but you can see how they form open spaces. And if those aggregates are able to maintain their integrity, then they will create open spaces. And organic matter is really sticky. We'll talk about that in compost. The microorganisms create and the worms create leave proteins behind that help to stick the aggregates together. And these are some different examples of soil structure. The one on the top left is what I'm talking about with the aggregates. These other are pretty firm. You can see there's not many open spaces. And those would be more what you would get with a clay soil. And then single grain would be like what you get with sand. And again, there's not much room for open spaces there. Soil organic matter aids in soil structure, reduces soil compaction. It helps with water infiltration in clay soils, but in sandy soils, it also helps to hold moisture in the soil. The sandy soil, everything just runs right through it. And most of us probably have, I don't know about clay. Does anybody have clay soil?
What do they have in Ponderosa Trail? I think that's clay.
I think that side of town has clay. I'm not positive that. And my soil is silt, and it's very fine. It acts like clay to some extent, but it doesn't mold as tightly as clay does. And then if you get farther out into Donny Park, you get more into sandy soil, and that has a different set of problems. But wherever you are, we have challenges with our soil. You can get more microbial activity if you have organic matter in the soil. The plants get nutrients from the organic matter, and I don't know if there's not likely to have too much organic matter here. So a few ways to add organic matter. Most people will suggest you're going to add like 4 inches on the top of the soil, and you could just rake it in if your soil is in pretty good shape, and then cover it with a mulch, and it will continue to work its way down. You do need to add organic matter at least once a year. Again, I don't worry about adding too much here. You want between 2 to 5%, and actually, because it's always breaking down, it's hard to get it more than 5%. It will help to build your soil structure. A gentle way, if you say your soil's not too good, but it's not terrible. When my soil was at its worst, I literally dug 18 inches down in every bed every year and worked in organic matter. And that was it just was necessary, I think, because otherwise the roots just couldn't get through. But once it started to get better, then I did what's called double digging. And for double digging, you would take about a shovel width and remove the topsoil down to about 8 inches, reserve it in a wheelbarrow. And then you would take a fork, a garden fork or a shovel, work it in the next layer, add the organic matter, which then can sift down into that next layer, and then put topsoil back. Usually what you do is you leave the topsoil and you work your way across, just moving the topsoil back. And then at the end, you put the topsoil from the first row back. But you do always want to try to keep the topsoil on top. And what I was doing was mixing it all up, which wasn't so good. Did you have a question? And, this is kind of a typical cycle for adding organic matter. I add compost probably 3 times a year. I put it on in the fall and cover it. Again, in the spring, I'll add some more and rake it in or turn it in. And then in the summer, when I'm planting, I'll put compost for mulch and then mulch on top of the compost. So constantly adding it. And for one, I mean, now I'm not having to really dig very deep. I kind of turn just the first few inches to break it up, but I'm finding that it's pretty loose all the way down. Soil texture. There's a simple test you can do to check the soil texture. Moisten a little bit of soil, get the rocks and out and kind of break it up and moisten it and rub it between your fingers. And if it feels gritty, that's a sandy texture. And if it feels really smooth, but not sticky, that's more of a silt texture. And if it feels sticky and you can kind of squeeze a ribbon out of it, that's clay, because it has that compactability and that moldability. So sand, and this isn't saying that it's silica sand. They're just whatever mother material you have, whatever rocks you have, the sand is from those. And so a typical grain of sand would be about 2 millimeters to 0.05 millimeters. Silt is not really visible to the naked eye, much smaller. And then clay is so fine, you have to have a microscope to see it. And then a better way to test it, this you can do, and this again, you have this, don't try to copy all this down. But this is the jar test for testing your soil texture. You spread some soil out on a piece of newspaper, get all the rocks and trash out of it, pulverize it, fill about a quart jar, about a quarter full with your soil. And then you add water up to about 3/4 full, add a teaspoon of a teaspoon of dishwasher detergent. There is a liquid dishwasher detergent. I don't think there's any powdered detergents. They're all in little pockets now. Or you could probably just use Dawn soap too. You just want something to help dissolve the connections between the particles. And then you shake it, put on some good music, dance around, shake it for about 15 minutes. And then you just let it set. Sand will settle out right away. Silt will take a couple hours, and the clay will take maybe 1 to 3 days because it emulsifies pretty completely. And what this is going to tell you, then you measure the full layer of your soil and each of the different layers. And what that's going to tell you is the percentages you have of sand, silt, and clay. And then what you want to know, and then you can look at this chart, which is really confusing to me to figure it out. But loam is what you want your soil to be, where it's 40% sand, 40% silt, 20% clay. But you can kind of figure out where your soil is, and that's going to help you to understand how it's going to drain, how well it's going to retain moisture. And so it's the first test that you might want to do. And again, we're going to send you this, so don't try to take time to draw that. And then how do you take a soil sample? So this guy has a fancy tool, but what you usually would do is dig a hole in one of your beds and then take a slice off the side of the hole. And that will give you several different layers because there's more nutrients at the top and probably less nutrients as you get to the bottom of about an 8-inch hole. And so you might want to have your soil tested. You can do a pH test yourself. There are lots of pH, there's pH meters and there's pH, simple pH tests cost about $20. Used to be $20, now they're probably $25. So you can kind of do those tests to get your pH. It's not maybe the most accurate test, but what you really need to know is your soil more alkaline or is it more acidic? And that will tell you what kind of amendments you need to add. But you can send your soil off. I've got a couple suggestions, but you'd really like to know how much phosphorus, how much potassium, how much nitrogen, and then these micronutrients, calcium, magnesium, sulfur. You know, a lot of us, and this is really weird because limestone is calcium carbonate largely, and yet I have a shortage of calcium in my yard, in my garden. And it's because I think that calcium carbonate is just too bound. It's not in a form that the plants can absorb it. And how do you know you have if you grow tomatoes, how do you know that you might have a calcium shortage? Blossom end rot. Early in the season, especially, somehow they seem to, well, I add bone meal if I get it. And this year, I've started spraying my squash and my tomatoes with milk. And milk is an antifungal, and people say it's as good as any antifungal on the market. And so it has helped to slow down powdery mildew on my squash. And I didn't have any blossom end rot this year because milk has lots of calcium in it. And you can use powdered milk. I use whole milk. I don't know if it makes any difference. You can use skim milk. So pH. pH is the measure of any substance, that how acidic it is or how alkaline it is. The lower numbers are acid and the higher numbers are alkaline. And my soil has a tendency to be around an 8.2, which not too many things grow at 8.2. Asparagus actually likes an alkaline soil, but maybe around 7.5. Most plants like a pH of around 6.5, between 6 and 7 somewhere. Some things like as much as 6, 8. Some things like it down in the low 6s. Potatoes like a pH down in the 5 range. And you know, and then blueberries like a pH about 4.2. Really hard to grow blueberries here because it's hard to get the soil adjusted. And what it means is that they're better at absorbing nutrients at that kind of a pH. And so, and for a long time, I thought I could adjust it with organic matter, but finally I've started using soil sulfur on my whole garden, but especially on my potato bed. And soil sulfur doesn't break down by water. It needs a bacteria to break it down. So sometimes I put it in my compost too, so that the compost bacteria can start breaking it down. Any questions about pH? So I don't know, does anybody know their pH? Does anybody have an acidic soil here? I think most of Arizona has alkaline soil. Certainly out in Doney Park, it's also more of that. Okay. This is a couple places that you can get soil tests done. You pretty much also could go on the internet. I would tend to go with something that seems legitimate, like a university, as opposed to just any, fly-by-night thing. Peaceful Valley used to do a really good job there, but they kind of really took a hit in the pandemic. They really dropped off a lot of their services, but they have videos on how to take the soil sample, how to send it in, and then they would give you had two choices. You could get most places, I think, give you two choices. You can get the simple, top 5 or 6 things, or you can get one that shows all the micronutrients and, other little things that, and then they hopefully have an explanation, just like, when you get a blood test and it says you're high. Well, what does that mean? It's like, but if you get a good, somebody who does a good job with the soil testing, they'll give you an explanation of, how to fix it. Sometimes the plants will tell you what your soil is missing. Slow growth is nitrogen, and yellow leaves is also a lack of nitrogen. Nitrogen, is like protein. It really helps to strengthen the plants. One of the things we get here sometimes, if people put a lot of nitrogen in their soil, and when they're growing tomatoes, the tomato plants will get really big and strong, but they won't produce any tomatoes. And so, you kind of need to get a good balance. And I think it can always be fixed. Phosphorus, you get poor blooms if you're low on, and poor fruit production if you're low on phosphorus. I use bat guano, or now they call it, everybody's scared of bats now, so they call it the cave blend, and it's bat guano and seagull guano, but the bird guano has a lot of phosphorus in it. And then stunted growth from potassium, and also phosphorus will give you kind of purple leaves if you're low on phosphorus. And potassium, one of the things you'll find here is, how sometimes when you cut into a tomato, the inside's white? That's from a lack of potassium, or not enough potassium, or not enough time, but that will not ever go away if your soil is low in potassium. And even though sometimes people say, oh, we have potassium in our soil, we have calcium, we have, yeah, but the plants aren't able to utilize it. So I use kelp meal for potassium. That's a pretty harmless way to add potassium. There's also this potassium murate, but that's kind of a harsh chemical. I try to avoid that. Oh, and the other thing that causes, especially the low nitrogen, is overwatering. It washes the nitrogen out of the soil, and so the plants can't get to it, and that will give you yellow leaves. So keep an eye out for, I had some peppers in pots. They're in big pots. I thought they were going to do fine. But the leaves started turning yellow, and I figured out that they weren't draining. It wasn't overwatering it that much, but the soil wasn't draining. And as a result, down where the roots were, there was too much water. Okay, so yes.
You mentioned the bird guano for phosphorus and kelp meal for potassium. What do you recommend for nitrogen?
Well, I use a couple things. I buy some generalized organic fertilizers, Happy Frog, the vegetable and tomato. I think it's called vegetable and tomato. I use that maybe once early in the season, but for nitrogen throughout the season, I use fish emulsion or fish fertilizer. It's a liquid. You dissolve it in water. It's pretty harmless. You can't overdo it. Might smell a little fishy for the first few hours, but it goes away pretty fast. Weed tea. Well, we made some at this seminar I was at. It smelled really bad. So the idea is that you get and you're supposed to, like, you let it steep for however long, and it gets really anaerobic, and then you add like a aquarium stone and to air and start aerating it, And that's when it gets to be good. I don't really understand the anaerobic part myself, but I know several people that swear by it.
What does coffee ground do for plants?
Coffee grounds are a good source of nitrogen. I put them in my compost. We're going to talk about that. Some people put them directly on their plants. Caffeine is not necessarily good for plants. People say coffee grounds are acidic, but generally when you brew your coffee, you neutralize most of the acid in the grounds. So you get coffee grounds from like Starbucks and stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but Starbucks just puts it out for free also.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. The ones with drive-throughs have the best supply. You get big bags from them. The grocery store ones have like little silver bags. But yeah, no, coffee is great. I know people that use it for a lot of different things. I like to compost it first, but people do use it straight. And it does have lots of nitrogen, yes.
Also, your chicken poop.
Chicken poop is great. Do you compost it or do you put it straight into your garden? Yep. People that have chickens think that heating up compost is really easy. Those of us who are making vegetarian compost, it's hard, much more challenging to heat it up. But no, chicken poop is great. There's no doubt. I didn't have very good luck I tried horse manure once, but it was too dry, I think. And it just didn't break down properly and didn't help. But we're going to talk more about poop as we
Frank,
go.
we got a question from Zoom. How do you know how much soil sulfur to use in your garden or compost?
It's on, I think it's probably on the bag. But, I just pretty much just broadcast it across the surface of the garden. Takes a long time to break down. And first you'd like to know how alkaline is your soil, because if it's not very alkaline, then you can probably just use organic matter. But if it's, up around 8 or 7.5, then I just sprinkle it all over the garden bed, and, it takes a while to break down. So I don't think you're going to get too much.
Thank you.
Okay, composting, turning food waste into black gold. Composting is a natural process of recycling organic matter, leaves, food scraps, and I don't think of compost so much as a fertilizer as I think of it as a soil amendment. Definitely has some nutrients, but it's nowhere near what we would consider a fertilizer. Worm castings you can consider a fertilizer, I think. So America wastes about 40% of all the food that we produce. And, it starts at the farm. If you ever seen asparagus or celery grow, the plants are actually about this big around. But what do we get in the store? A plant about this big around. And like right in the field, they cut off a lot of those outer stalks, which might be a little tougher, and they leave them in the field, and then they plow them under. And so they do get turned back into the ground, but they're not used as food. I have heard of food banks gleaning that extra celery, but I've volunteered a lot at the food bank, and there's lots of celery around, and you don't really have to go out and pick it up. And then Americans tend to waste about 40% of what we buy. The same thing. You buy a bunch of celery so you can make chicken salad, and then you don't have a use for the rest of that bunch of celery. But we can compost that stuff, and we'll talk more about that. So compost is a rich soil-like material. It's full of nutrients and it's full of microorganisms. And we want to keep those microorganisms alive when we put them in the soil, and then they will continue to break down organic matter and improve the soil and improve the soil structure. During compost, aerobic oxygen-loving bacteria consume organic matter, break it down into nutrients that plants can easily absorb. As they're breaking it down, they're releasing these enzymes, and those start chemical reactions, and that's what causes the compost to heat up. And as the compost heats up, a different group of bacteria take over, thermophilic bacteria, and they can live up to like 180 degrees. We'll talk about trying to keep the compost hot. Getting it up to 135 is not too hard, especially if you have chicken manure. Keeping it up higher than that, and sometimes you see these compostable plates and stuff. and they need about 180 to break down. So they are compostable, but it's difficult to do in a home compost pile. Little diagram of how it works. Organic matter goes in with water, microorganisms and oxygen, and water, CO2 and heat are released, and out comes finished compost, which is active organic matter, which we're going to go over that in just a sec. What are some of the benefits of composting? Exercise. The age-old question, should I go to the gym today or should I just go turn the compost? Enriches soil, helps retain moisture, suppress plant diseases, and those microorganisms compete with the pests that we don't want to help push them out. Reduces need for chemical fertilizers, encourages the production of beneficial bacteria and fungi, helps to create humus, which we're going to go into a bit more detail about. Reduce waste from going into the landfill, where, you know, we send bags of pine needles and bags of green matter to but they're not interacting, so the green matter is breaking down and producing methane. Composting is fun. It's really neat to see the pile heat up and you know, start to break down and change and start to smell good. Oops, that worked. Let's talk about the different steps. First, we have to select our materials. Then we have to have a container, a location, provide proper ventilation because we want aerobic microorganisms. Anaerobic microorganisms will cause it to smell and produce methane and ammonia. Maintain proper moisture. We want it damp as a wet sponge. Maintain the desired temperature, whether it's cool or hot. We want to make sure it's working and is heating up somewhat. And cure the finished product and then strain it. So for creating a carbon-nitrogen balance, the microorganisms need a combination of high carbon and high nitrogen. We call the high nitrogen greens, we call the high carbon organic matter browns, and we need a balance of that. And carbon and nitrogen ratio expressed as CN. Carbon is always the bigger number, it always comes first, and nitrogen is always expressed as a 1. The ideal ratio for compost is 30 to 1. 30 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. High carbon browns range from 60 to 1 to 400 to 1. High nitrogen greens range from 7 to 1 to 40 to 1. A lot less gap in the greens than there is in the browns. And when you combine them, you're sort of going to be averaging the different carbon and nitrogen ratios from the different materials that you add. But you can't exactly average it without knowing the mass and the water content and all these technical things. You'd have to measure and weigh everything, and it's not worth that. So let's look at some of the materials we might use for browns. Wood chips, very high in carbon, also very slow to break down, so they don't release all that carbon at once. Cardboard's actually a good ingredient, especially corrugated with the little holes in it. Sawdust, be careful. Commercial sawdust is likely to have some chemicals on it, so they don't want termites in in the wood at Home Depot. But if it's from logs being sawed, it would be okay. Newspaper, actually pretty good ingredient. It's actually kind of slow to break down. Most newspapers use an ink that's not harmful. It's 175(1) in terms of carbon. Straw is really good because it's hollow and it's kind of fluffy. Helps to open up the pores to get air into your compost bin. Dried leaves are really good. And pine straw is challenging, but I've got a whole section on how to do pine straw, and we have plenty of it. So it's a good thing to use, but it does take a little extra work. Pine straw, dried leaves, and wood chips all contain a substance called lignins, or substances called lignins, and they will not break down by bacteria. They will only break down by fungus. So some people will actually try to, will just use fungus. But I think if you compost those products, they'll break down part of what makes up the, and then at the end, if you cure it, you let it cool down enough that fungus can do the rest. And the fungus that grows on wood is also really good for creating soil structure. So for greens, well, fresh leaves are not something we really have every day. Garden waste, it's a pretty good thing. Just make sure there's no diseases. Like if you have squash plants with a lot of powdery mildew on them, you don't want to put them in compost. Alfalfa hay, it's gotten to be kind of expensive, but it's a high protein hay, which is really good at heating up compost. Fruit and vegetable scraps both work. I think they're better at adding additional nutrients and moisture. They don't have a lot of nitrogen in them. Manures can certainly be very good. I think from what I've heard, chicken manure is better than horse manure. Coffee grounds are definitely a great ingredient. One cool thing about coffee grounds is they never smell bad. They as they're breaking down, they never, go sour. Cabbage, however, even if you're not anaerobic, it will still smell because rotting cabbage smells. That's just the nature of it. Beer mash is a really good thing. Most of the breweries have a contract for their beer mash because they have a lot of it and they need somebody to take all of it. And I think they give, I think it mostly goes to pig farmers who it's really great for fattening up pigs. You can also make crackers out of it. Grass clippings, as long as there's no pesticides on them. Vegetable scraps. We've already talked about that. They're okay. Lots of moisture. I go to I call it the food bank, but it's really the Flagstaff Family Food Center warehouse on Huntington. And they have what they call farm food. So when food no longer looks good enough to give to families, then they let farmers take it. And, you don't get good stuff every time you go in there, but sometimes you'll get, whole cases of broccoli florets that you don't have to chop or anything and they're just ready to go. There's lots of, and you're helping them because their goal is to have zero waste. And if they give it to farmers or gardeners, then it also is part of that. Yes.
Where would things like tortilla chips and I've heard that the only things you don't want to compost are proteins, dairy, and oils. So.
I have a list of things here that we're going to go over of things you don't want to do.
Okay.
Well, tortilla chips have salt on them. Tortillas are probably fine. I have composted a lot of tortillas, but I don't think I'd do tortilla chips because they're going to have some residue of oil on them and they're going to have more salt on them. And you probably don't want salt as an end result in your garden. That would just, with what?
With French fries.
Yeah. There's a little bit, yeah, probably not. But bread is okay and tortillas are okay. A lot of times at the food bank, they'll have, just tons of, moldy bread. And that's okay.
Moldy stuff.
Yep. Mold is one of the things that one of the microorganisms that, it's a fungus. Yep. I brought home like 6 flats of moldy strawberries. I mean, you couldn't even hardly tell they were strawberries, like this big around and just with a gray and green mold on them. And yeah, that's great. And the worms love moldy strawberries. So let's take an example of combining greens and browns. Straw is about 75-1, carbon and nitrogen. Vegetables about 25-1. And if we do 2 parts, we usually combine 2 brown to 1 green. And if you don't do that, the greens kind of compress and get, it's hard to get oxygen in between them. So you want kind of more brown that helps to fluff things up. The browns also help to create humus. So anyway, if you do 2 straw to 1 vegetable, you come out about 60-1, which is not very good and is not going to really work very well in a compost. It's not going to heat up. So what do you do to fix that problem? I mean, some people do 1-to-1, brown to green, but I think a better option is to do hot greens. Hot greens are things that are very hot, very high in nitrogen. Beer mash is one of them. Cornmeal is one, and you can buy a 5-pound bag. Well, sometimes it's as cheap as $5 and sometimes it might be $7, but you know, you put a couple pounds in a batch of compost and it will help to heat it up. Alfalfa meal, that would be like rabbit food. Again, there's a trace amount of salt in rabbit food. Blood meal is super expensive. I wouldn't do that. Livestock manure and alfalfa hay that I mentioned before. Those are things that will help to increase, and you can still use a lot of vegetable matter and a lot of browns, and it helps. I had a compost bin. It was kind of pretty chilly out, and compost bin was pretty much just cold. It was about 60 degrees, and I turned it and added about 3 or 4 pounds of cornmeal to it, and it just heated right up to 135. So let's talk about hot composting and cold composting. And I apologize for the serious gardener. You could be any kind of gardener and want to do hot or cold. Most people actually do cool composting. Hot composting heats up to 110 to 155 or more. Breaks down much faster. It requires a lot of nitrogen and a lot of oxygen. It's more labor intensive because you have to turn it more often. It may destroy weed seeds, insect larvae, and pathogens. And it's, at least for the dedicated composter who wants to spend, you know, time turning compost every week. Cool composting will run between 85 and 105. So if you're not getting it up to 85, you probably do need to add something hotter. It breaks down more slowly. It may take 6 months to a year to break down. You still need to turn it maybe once a month. If you use vent pipes, maybe less. And this is, you know, for somebody who's busy and doesn't have time to be constantly turning it. Things not to compost. I don't think anybody's coal or charcoal ash makes sense. People do ask about wood, ashes from their wood stove. You can add them, but the thing is they're alkaline. So if your soil's alkaline, it might not be the best thing. Same thing with eggshells. People put them in compost, but for us, our soil is alkaline, so it's a good source of calcium. You have to make that decision about the alkalinity. Dairy products will create odors. Diseased or insect-ridden plants are just going to add more problems to your compost. Fat, grease, and lards are going to create odor problems and attract rodents. Well, meat and fish, some people do it. There's Art Babbitt has started a commercial composter out on the east side, and he says he can maintain enough temperature to break down meats, and but I think it's adding a lot of challenge to your composting to do that. I mean, more chances of pathogens and other things. It's hard, I think, for us to keep that kind of temperature and to turn it as much as it needs to be turned. Pet waste, that's just pretty much out, especially cat waste, and yard trimmings that might be treated with pesticides. Grass clippings are really good, but you have to make sure that they haven't been treated with pesticides. So we've talked about selecting materials. Let's talk about, and then we're going to go through these other items, starting with containers. And so kind of the general wisdom for composting is that you want a compost pile that's a cubic yard, 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. That's a lot of stuff for a household gardener. This is a Earth Machine. I've had this one for about 30 years. And it's about a third of a yard. It takes 10 5-gallon buckets of stuff to fill this. So a cubic yard is about 25 5-gallon buckets. And that's a lot of stuff. Now, if you have livestock, or you have a farm, or you have some other source that's easy to gain organic matter, that a cubic yard, the thing about it is big enough to insulate itself so that it can maintain the heat in the center. Also, you need vent pipes, in my opinion. I saw one at this event I was at in Rimrock, and there were no vent pipes, so, I mean, it's 3 feet across and, you know, that's a long way for air to move through this really dense compost. There are a lot of different kinds of compost bins. They're all kind of similar to this in some respects. So if you use one of these, when they first get them, they break in the middle, which makes it a little bit easier to turn. But after a while, they stop fitting back together. And I don't know if you have javelina where you are, but I have javelina and they love to turn over compost bins. That's why this sling is on the top. So I cinch it down with a compression strap. But anyway, when you get ready to turn it, you can't really stir inside here. So you pick the whole thing up and you move it over and then you shovel it from back into the new location. But if you're trying to turn, it's really impossible. Your shoulders will hurt. A lot of them don't have a bottom like that. That's really good because earthworms and bacteria can come up from the ground. Some do have a bottom. I have a friend, he's a really good gardener. He wants a solid compost bin. He had to order from Europe with a solid bottom because he was getting so many mice in his compost. Sometimes I'll get like one mouse and my cat will just sit by the compost bin and wait for it to come out. So let's go on to other kinds. So that's how it splits, but eventually the groove gets and the tabs get broken and the groove gets messed up. These are some examples of homemade bins, one made out of a pallet, one made out of livestock fencing, and one made out of blocks. In Arizona, you would need to cover these because if you don't have your compost covered here, it's going to dry out really fast, and then you're going to get a monsoon and it's going to just get saturated. So getting it just right is always going to be a challenge. Proper ventilation. You really want it to be aerobic. That's why I kind of like these bins. I used to do piles. Now I do bins because they have vents on the side. And then I also take a piece of PVC pipe and I drill holes in it and I put it down in the middle. And if I had one that was a full cubic yard, I would put maybe 3 or 4 in it. And
A black trash can that I built over the bottom and then the sides. Would you recommend a PVC pipe, even though it's already?
do you think it's getting enough air?
YouTube said,
Yes, I wasn't sure if I would need it additional.
well, maybe, some, yeah.
Either that or drill more holes.
Okay.
I have one, I made one out of a trash can. I used to bring it, and then you can turn it on its side and roll it to help turn it.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's what I did. It's like, it sits above the ground and you actually just turn it, and then there's 2 sides. So you can have this going at a different speed. Or like, so I kind of filled this one and keep rotating it, and then started this one new, so that
Wow.
they're kind of operating at 2 different
Yeah.
capacities or whatever, and then it has a thermometer on the side. So
Wow.
you can tell, you can tell the heat of it.
Yeah.
And then it's black and it just has like vents that you can open and close.
So you put the thermometer inside of it, so.
It's like, it's stuck through on the middle, so you can tell
Wow.
the temperature of both of the sides.
That sounds like a pretty cool one. The only problem I've had with anything that rotates, including the trash can, is they get really heavy sometimes.
Yeah.
They can be hard. I got one from Home Depot and I filled it up. It had a crank, and then just snapped the handle right off when it got really heavy. And I'm like,
This is nice because you just like roll the whole tumble, so
Right.
you're just kind of like clawing.
Oh, good.
and it rolls.
It got too heavy for me. I had a tumble one too. And I was like, I can't do this.
well, and I think it's good if you don't have really heavy stuff. Like mine gets really heavy because I put lots of coffee in it and lots of vegetable matter, which is full of moisture. So mine gets really heavy. But if you don't have to do that, if there's hay and alfalfa hay and, your food scraps, not too much heavy stuff, it probably works just fine. Vent pipe helps with air. Loose ingredients like straw and hay help to create more air spaces. Turning compost to expose it to fresh air is probably the best thing you can do. But if you're not going to turn it too often, then you have to rely more on these other things. This is a different one. It's bigger than this, but it works fine. Pine needle composting with a vent pipe. bin composting versus piles. Bins are more attractive. They're probably more expensive up front, but like I said, this one's oh, I'm so
Well,
sorry.
that's all right. We can leave it there and that way you can keep your return. I think we're fine.
Sorry, guys. Upright bins get better airflow. Bins are open on the bottom, they're still in contact with the earth. And turning compost will be more labor intensive. Compost in a pile, it's a little easier to keep it warm. If you have a cover like a black plastic or black tarp. The lower profile of a compost pile means that it's more in contact with the ground. It's easier to turn in a way because you can just rake it from one side and then rake it back. And you don't have to actually pick it all up. When it's really wet at the bottom, it's pretty heavy to do that, to turn it. I don't think there's any way you can get as good an airflow. I used to do piles all the time, put vent pipes in them. I still don't think I could get as much airflow. This was a pile in my backyard. Mostly broken down, but it was really cold, so I covered it with cardboard and then black plastic. And then it snowed 3 feet and I still went out and temped it. And it was 58 degrees in a big storm, which means that the inside was probably still, maybe 80 or so. So it did okay. You're a compost nerd if you go out and tempt your compost in the middle of a snowstorm. And this is curing. As a process of spreading out hot compost to let it cool down, and then it'll slowly decompose, and this allows fungus and maybe worms to get into it, because worms can't live at 135 very well. They will kind of move to the outside and survive. Covering it with straw to keep it from drying out too much. And then the finished product, you want it to have shrunk maybe by about half. It'll cool down to room temperature. It's dark and crumbly. Most of it is unrecognizable. There might still be a corn cob or, broccoli stem or something that you're going to end up straining out. It'll smell sweet. You can test it by bagging it in a Ziploc, smell it a week later. If it's not done, it will have gone anaerobic and it will smell really bad. But if it still smells nice and sweet. Oh, so I have.
When you say
Compost.
smell sweet, what, like,
Earthy sweet,
okay,
not like dessert sweet.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
No.
Don't eat compost.
yeah, that's too much.
Yeah.
So I have compost here, worm castings, and this is a leaf mold. You can it has some of that white fungus in it if you want to look at it and you can smell it. You can open it if you want. Try not to spill it. Rusty will never forgive me. I skipped a couple of things because I wasn't. I want to talk about the differences in organic matter. So for composting, fresh organic matter would be still recognizable. It's not fresh enough to eat. Might be about moldy zucchini or slimy lettuce, but that's fresh organic matter. And then there's active organic matter, and that's what finished compost is going to be. Active organic matter still has nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus in it. It has plant food still in it. And then there's what's called passive organic matter, and that is humus. And humus has lost all its plant food qualities, but it still has a lot of good things for building soil structure. It helps to attract micronutrients. It becomes a home for the microorganisms, and it helps with pH and water content. And, so out of a batch of compost, you might have a little bit of humus. And, but mostly when you first finish, it's going to be mostly active organic matter. Oh. Oops. Oh, okay. The life and times of a compost pile. So this is this is a really aggressive hot compost. If you're doing cool compost, you could change the week or 10 days to like a month. So you layer your compost in your compost bin. and you wet every layer. And it'll take it a couple of days to heat up to 135 degrees. And then when the temp has gone back down, you can turn it and add more stuff. And then add water as needed.
Mhm.
Pile will take a little bit of time to heat back up. And then again, you do the same thing over again. And then you repeat, turning and adding more stuff. And after about 3 or 4 times, you stop adding new stuff. And then you just let it, you keep turning it and let it continue to break down. This is kind of where you get into the idea that you kind of need 2 different compost bins. You have 2 built in. Because at some point you need to stop adding stuff to the old bin so it can finish. And I mean, the new one, the second bin could be a pile, be made out of a garbage can, you know, with holes drilled in it. But you need to be able to stop adding stuff to let the older pile finish. And then you're looking for it to be completely broken down, but really maybe it's like 90% broken down, because there'll be some things that are resistant to breaking down, like corn cobs, maybe broccoli stems, tomato stems are terrible. So you might just end up straining those things out, and then you could put them back into a new compost bin, or you could just discard them. And then it's ready to cure and spread it out, cover with burlap or straw, something breathable, and let it sit for another month, and hopefully fungus will continue to break it down. And I'm going to go back because I forgot this time. Oh, that's it. So steps. I had this other stuff in my notes, but today I was just looking at the slides, not at my notes, so I missed something. Maintaining moisture, damp as a wet sponge. I never really understood the damp as a wet sponge, but basically it needs to be wet, especially in Flagstaff, because things dry out so fast. But if you take a handful of it and squeeze it, you don't want it to be moist enough that you can squeeze moisture out. Too much moisture will make it go anaerobic, because there's no air spaces, you know, for the air to get through, so the air can't get to the microorganisms. So damp, and then but it does need to stay damp. When my wife started gardening before I did. She gardened for a couple of years, and then she got busy with work and she stopped. And I didn't pick it up for a few years after that. And this compost bin sat out in the yard full of compost or full of vegetables for 3 years. And then I go, okay, I'm going to compost. And so I pull it up, and you could still see the layers. You could still recognize cauliflower and broccoli, because it's so dry here that they just kind of dehydrated. They didn't break down at all. That's an idea. You need moisture. Maintain the desired temperature, whether it's hot or cold compost. You know, you need a compost thermometer. Oops. And these, you sort of read from the whole length. Having one built in is really kind of cool. I've never seen that before. But, you know, so let's let you know how you're doing. If you don't want to, they're cost about $20, or they used to cost $20. That one's been around for a while. If you don't want to spend the money, you have a thermometer at the end of your arm. You just stick your hand down in it. If it's really hot, you have to pull it out. You got really hot compost. But most likely, you know, you'll feel it before you get too hot. And then curing is a matter of trying to let the fungus get in and do some work. The other thing I missed, which was in my notes, well, I actually think we did cover it. Let's go back here. Okay, potential problems. Smells like ammonia. Means it's gone anaerobic. Probably could be too much nitrogen. Could be needs to be turned, or just not enough brown. It's out of balance, or being too wet can also make it happen. Generally, I would add more brown and turn it, and it probably will calm down. Also could be not getting enough airflow. It's not breaking down, means you have too much carbon, not enough green. Too dry, won't break down, or not enough oxygen and it won't turn it. But if it doesn't have enough oxygen, you're probably going to smell it, that problem. Not getting hot, high nitrogen greens, turning it more often, and make sure it is wet enough. In the winter here, it can freeze, literally the outside can freeze, even if it's working. Adding more hot green material, manure, alfalfa grains, blood meal. Having it in a sunny spot helps a lot in the winter, and having it be of a dark color. I have covered this one with a tarp. I don't like doing that because it's going to interfere with the airflow. You can use hot water. I normally use, I have a trash can near my compost area that I fill up with rainwater. And in the winter, I have to break the ice off the top of it. That's a little bit, not exactly helping it to heat up. But I moved it to a sunnier spot from a couple of years ago, and I'm having less trouble with it staying warm. And I also composted Olivia White Hospice Garden. And I don't know if you know where that's at the bottom of Schweitzer Canyon, so all the cold air flows right down. And our compost bin is in a low spot besides that. And it's just frozen solid. I mean, just solid. But we get it started in the fall. It sits all winter. It doesn't work very fast, but by spring, it's usually getting pretty close. Pine needles, or how I learned to love all those pine needles. I have 16 ponderosa pines in my yard. We're the largest contiguous ponderosa pine forest in the country, maybe the world. Yeah, I think that's right. Yep. That's my neighbors, pine needles. But you need some special techniques to compost pine needles. They have ponderosa pine needles are 7 inches long, give or take. They have a almost waterproof cuticle on the outside. And so the inside always stays dry. And, but if you break it up, you can, I use an electric lawnmower and just self-mulching lawnmower, just run over them over and over again to break them up. You can also run over them with a car. You can put them in a trash can with a weed whacker and put a weed whacker in. It's not much fun. My weed whacker wasn't strong enough. They came out whole pretty much, but I've heard of people doing that. But they don't break down on their own. Maybe and I age them always for the winter, and now I'm about a year behind on my pine needles, but that makes them a little bit more easier to break up, I think. Once I grind them, I pre-soak them for about 3 days, and that sounds kind of weird, but you're not doing anything. You put them in a 5-gallon bucket and let them sit for 3 days. And they'll actually, they'll absorb all the water in the 5-gallon bucket, and the end will turn white because they're starting to bloat. And then they compost pretty normally. But if you put dry pine needles into the compost pile, it just keeps absorbing the water, and it slows things way down. But you could do it. Pre-mixing browns and greens, that works really well with spent grains too, because spent grains will smell really bad if you don't mix them up with some browns. But for pine needles, it also kind of helps just to get the process started a little faster. Hot composting is probably helpful. I have composted whole pine needles, and they did compost, but when I got done, they were still whole pine needles. But then when I strained it, they break down. So it's like, would you rather grind them ahead of time, or would you want to grind them with your hand later on? It's they will break down at that point. You can tell they turn kind of black to gray. That's when they're actually starting to compost, or I've composted, yes.
The aging pine needles, how long do you want to age them, and do you want to grind them before you age them?
It would be better to grind them beforehand. I don't do that because I'm grinding the old pine needles from the year before. So I'm using whole pine needles as mulch on my beds. I think a year is okay. It's not going to, I worked with Washington State Extension Office. They challenged us to compost pine needles, and I kind of got obsessed with it. And I actually went and met with the guy because I had another reason to go to Spokane. And they did say pre-grinding them and then using them for mulch or letting them sit they would break down much faster if you did that. And I assume that's probably, they get snow and rain, and so they're they probably would be wet a lot of that time. So it probably would help. but I'm hard enough finding time to grind the ones that I need to put into compost today, you know? And it's a little bit, I use well, that was my first lawnmower. That was a free lawnmower. You know, I couldn't really say no. The guy offered to give me a lawnmower. I've spent $300 on that lawnmower, and finally I just gave it to Goodwill and bought an electric one. So, but it does take a little bit of power, and there's, you know, now there's 40 horsepower electric lawnmowers that, and you can buy them on sale in the fall. But anyway, and that's what that's what the pile looked like. And that's what it looked like after it was ground. So they really do break down. And then that's them soaking. And this was pre-mixing some lettuce and some soaked pine needles. And it looks like a pine needle salad. Probably sticking your, okay. So any questions about just general composting or soil or anything else before we talk about worms? Yes.
One thing you mentioned is that you broadcast the nutrients onto your soil. How do you avoid the leaves?
The leaves.
Right, because if you're just throwing your fish meal or whatever out into your garden.
Keep
isn't
it from getting
bad
on the
for
leaves? I don't do that once I have the plants. When I have the plants, I do try to avoid, I sprinkle it and I use fish emulsion, not fish meal. So it's a liquid.
Okay.
So then I basically just water with it.
Okay.
No, I don't, and I don't put, soil sulfur is considered safe except on the leaves. If it's the leaves, it will burn the leaves. But I only do that in the fall, and then I might do it late winter, but I don't do anything like that after I've planted my plant.
Okay,
I only use organic, like the Happy Frog organic fertilizer, which is basically just grains. So, but I don't even probably do that much after I've got the plants in the ground. I mostly use liquids.
so am I hearing you say you don't fertilize the plants after you've got them in the ground?
Well, I fertilize them with some liquids.
Okay.
Well, and kelp meal. I do sometimes will mix up like kelp meal. And if I had to use bone meal, which I don't really have to use anymore, I'd mix that in with some soil and then sprinkle it in between. But yeah, I do avoid the leaves and the stems when I'm putting fertilizers on. But nothing, it's all organic. So nothing's too damaging. And the soil sulfur is considered okay for organic gardening, but it will hurt the leaves. Oh, good question.
What about like gardens that have perennials and like there's always green leaves? I mean, most of the year. Do you still put it in there or do you not or?
Well, yeah, it's a bit more challenging for sure. I have strawberries, and they're, you know, they're in this fall, the bed's full of leaves. I use fish emulsion, so it's a liquid, and it's not going to hurt them at all.
It smells weird.
What's that?
It smells weird.
Yeah, yeah, it can smell a little fishy. Yeah, but it only lasts for a day or so. Yes.
Add like cinnamon to get rid of some pests or like cayenne pepper to like keep the rodents away. Does that impact the composition of the soil at all?
Not that I know of. At Olivia White, we have deer problems and rodent problems, and I have cages around my vegetables, but the woman who does flowers, she uses cayenne and red pepper flakes. And as far as I know, it doesn't do any harm. Yeah, I wondered the same thing, but as far as I know, it does not.
Question from Zoom,
Okay.
with the usage of PIC piping, is that right, PIC? Is that right? PIC piping? Does that mean anything to you? Anyway, I'll just keep reading. With the usage of PIC piping in your compost bins for air assist, is it best to place several holes in the piping, PVC, of each pipe, or a few on each side?
I randomly put holes all around the pipe. I think the more you do, the better, but it's just a matter of getting tired of drilling holes. Yeah, I randomly drill holes all the way around, and I so far I've tried to keep the pipe inside the compost bin. It's better in the winter, but I have wondered about maybe cutting a hole in the top and having the pipe come out in the summer so that we get better airflow. I just haven't tried that yet. Is that satisfactory?
That is, thank you.
I still don't know what the first word was, but maybe that was a typo. Okay, how many people raise worms? Maybe?
Just inherited a bunch of
You
worms.
did?
Some compost friend gave me some very good.
Cool. Well, I had my master gardener class and they said, yeah, you can just raise worms. And I thought it was a great idea. So, usually there's certain worms that are more suited for eating compost. California red wigglers are a common one. Night crawlers are also sold as compost worms. Earthworms will eat compost, but they also eat minerals. They eat the soil and they roam more freely and they don't do so well in captivity. Though I do know somebody who is using earthworms for compost worms. If you have manure, they tend to eat manure. Anyway, well, we'll get on. So, but California red wigglers, they really need organic matter. It's not, I don't think they can eat soil, but they do consume both browns and greens. So the bedding is usually a brown, and then you put vegetable matter in there that is a green. And they're kind of picky eaters. They don't eat garlic. They don't eat cabbage. I haven't seen them eat mushrooms. But they eat a lot of fruit, lettuce, greens, carrots, and they don't have teeth. So things have to be kind of soft. Either you let them age and start to break down, or we microwave some of the food so it's soft enough for them to eat. You keep them in a special container, and this is a homemade example here. It's a 10-gallon Rubbermaid bin, and they need oxygen, so you drill holes in the top and the sides, bigger holes to get oxygen in. They breathe out carbon dioxide, so you drill little holes down low, and they also produce, or the whole bin produces a lot of moisture, so I have holes in the bottom to allow it to drain. Some people call that worm tea. I think it's actually worm pea. I don't think it is actually composted. I think what you need to do, if you want to make worm pea, you take some of your worm castings and you put it in a mesh bag and you put it in a 5-gallon bucket with a aquarium stone, and you aerate it for like 24 hours, and it's supposed to be good for about 24 hours after that. But you could take this, the liquid, which is technically called leach-it, that comes off the bottom, and just pour it into your compost or into a bed. I just don't think you want to spray it on your plants because it could still have some phytotoxins in it. So let's see. They need the airflow, but they also like to escape. So if the holes are too big, you'll find worms that escape. They also will sometimes escape through the bottom, and even though they're sitting in a liquid. They need a moderate temperature. They can live between like 40 and 85. I do have worms out in my garden. I'll explain that in a minute. For bedding, you can use cocoa fiber, shredded newspaper, or compost. Food is mainly kitchen scraps. They love avocado husk, banana peels, old lettuce. They'll eat coffee grounds. They'll eat the filters. Once they've consumed all the scraps, they'll eat some of the core fiber. And when you're ready to harvest them, we use this upper tier method. And you can buy these wormeries that have multiple layers, and you take they have a drawer that you take the castings out on the bottom, and a drawer that catches all the liquid off the bottom. We put this upper tier that has holes drilled in it, and then we put more bedding in there, and we put food on top of that, and they'll crawl up from the bottom bin into the top bin. And then when you've got most of them have moved up, then you can go through and get the stragglers. And this is the volcano method, it's called. You basically make piles. The worms hate light. So you put a light on it, they'll move down to the bottom of the pile and you can harvest the castings off the top. You can tell this was this was pine needle compost. And then once you've gotten all the castings off the top, you move the piles together and do it again. Oops. And I have worms up here you can see and play with if you'd like. Any questions about raising worms? Oh, moving them out, go ahead.
Say, are worms that you use for compost the same as the worms you want in your garden? Does it matter?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, you really want earthworms in your garden because they'll make bigger holes, they travel farther. So when I first started doing this 6 years ago or something, people said you could never put them out in the garden. And then the worm whisperers all got together and decided it's okay to put them out in the garden, but you have to make sure they have plenty of organic matter to eat. So now, in fact, so I take 5-gallon buckets, and I'm not sure if I'm doing it the best way. I cut the bottom off, I drill big holes in the sides, and I put that dig a hole, put it in a garden bed, and then I put the bedding and the worms in that, and then I put food on top of that. And they come up, eat the food. When it gets really cold, they go down deeper, and they do just fine. But you kind of need a way to get them that organic matter. And I find them, well, and now the question is the worms that are in my bed, are they the California red wigglers, or was there earthworms who thought, oh, there's food over here, and they came and joined in the party? But it looked to me like they were earthworms, because I just dug up a bed that had a bucket in it of worms, and I thought there were an awful lot of earthworms in there that weren't there last year. But it could be a mix, and they're compatible. They don't fight or anything. They can live together. So now that's kind of become a new thing. And actually you heard of Vigo garden beds? They sell a worm bed to put in your garden. It's got big holes, bigger holes than I made. And so it's become kind of a thing now. And I
It's
think,
like a clasp on the top, so you just open it, put it in the organic matter and close it.
oh,
So
cool.
you don't have to worry about like other critters getting into it.
Well, I put a rock on top of my
Yeah.
5-gallon bucket.
Yeah.
The Vigo ones are $50. But I did think I learned from them that I could make much bigger holes and that it would be probably more effective. And I think somebody said that you don't really need the hole in the bottom then, that they can just go out through the holes on the side. So might be something. Another question?
If you have raised beds or you're doing container gardening, do you want to try to control the number of worms in that space, or does that matter? Because if you have, what I wonder is, if you have too many worms in a container, are they going to try to eat the plants?
They won't eat the plants.
So what is the problem? They just won't live, they won't be happy. Why wouldn't you want them in?
Well, I mean, if they don't have enough to eat, they'll die. And then they'll become organic matter. Yeah, that's heartless, but yeah. My wife treats the worms like they're pets. I think she's starting to name them. But yeah, so we worry about every worm that gets out of the thing and dies on them, because if they get out and we don't find them, they die right away because they can't live outside the moisture. I don't think you want too many in a container garden. I don't know that they won't eat the plants. That's the cool thing about the microorganisms and the worms. The ones that eat the roots are not the ones that, are not compost. The ones that we want eat compost. They don't eat live material, so there's not a danger that way. But in a raised bed, I don't think it's a problem. I mean, they say you want 40 worms per cubic foot. That's a lot of worms. But in a container, yeah, I think they just would keep running out of food. And you could put compost on top and, and then mulch. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I'm gonna point it at these things over here.
Oh, okay.
So everyone can see.
You want to bring it over here and we can
Yeah.
show them the worms?
We could set them on the table.
Yes.
One more question,
Oh.
about fungus. I've seen in some of my garden, you'll get little, mushrooms that grow. I've heard that's a very good, shows that you have a very robust kind of ecosystem. Is that your experience, or?
I've never had a problem with mushrooms, yeah.
Okay.
It's just another kind of fungus. Don't eat them. Um, but, I don't think it's a problem. I think for the most part, fungus is good. Oh, you wanna get this one too?
Yeah.
You guys can come up and look, but we'll take this over by the camera and let them look inside. If you have kids, they love worms. Is that good?
I think so. It could be a little experimentation.
Oh, so they really don't like light, and you have holes in the top of your bin, so you put a piece of paper or something, and eventually they'll just eat the paper. Oh man, that's a lot of worms. Can you hold it? Can you see inside? Can you come closer? Yeah, I can see them. So a year after we started doing this, we went to Europe for 5 weeks. And so, like, what am I gonna do with the worms? And I got a really big cardboard box. And I filled it with a whole batch of compost and put all the worms and their bedding in it. I put a whole bunch of food on top and a whole bunch of straw on top of that. And went to Europe for 5 weeks, and I came back and they ate the food, they ate the compost, and they ate the box. They were like just on the ground, and top of the box was still there, but they were like right ready to move into the ground, and then we recaptured them. Been gone another week, they'd have been gone, I think. Any other questions? Yes.
Comment, that's fast, 5 weeks, and they already had all of that.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. I was and I had a guy who, I think he was supposed to, I think he put a little bit more food in, but I don't think he put in nearly enough. It was a lot of worms. I think we probably had 3 bins at that point. We've gotten up as much as 5 bins that are just as full as this one. And right now we're down to 2. A woman I met at this thing in Rimrock, she just took several thousand worms, which we were glad. We were like tired of feeding so many worms.
Where do you find the worms?
I'll be happy to get you started.
I'll take them.
Okay, usually you get a pound and then it'll turn into a full bin in, a fairly short amount of time. No, I just gave this woman 1,000 or so worms, and she had all kinds. She had a bin, and she also had some planters that had a place for worms to live in the middle. And yeah, it was kind of a tower, and so anyway, no, we've just shared them with people. Yes.
I've seen people collecting compost in bins in their freezer, and they say that helps kind of break down some of it. Is that accurate? Is that something that you should do?
Compost or stuff they're gonna
parts,
put in
the-
compost?
Like vegetable and fruit kind of scraps.
Yeah. Well, I think
Does it
freezing
really-
probably helps break down the cell structure, so it makes it easier to access for the microorganisms. And that's what I think when the compost bin freezes at Olivia White, it's like, well, that's probably just helping it to break down, but I wouldn't my freezer's full of food. I wouldn't put scraps in there. Yeah. But no, I don't think it's a problem. I think it does break down the cell structure, makes them probably break down faster. Anything else? Cool. Well, we made it just about on time.
Thank you. Thank you.
Someday I'll learn how to look at my notes and the slide at the same time. It's like go back and forth.
Yeah, 'cause it'll be the last time I.